الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الحمد لله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Hope everybody is doing well. So inshallah we'll start off with just a quick review of the class from last time, and then we'll get into the topic for today. And by the way, Brother Malik has graciously cooked some delicious food, and he has really would love if everybody would join and eat. So please feel free to get food, eat, inshallah, during the class, inshallah, or after as well if you'd like. Great. So last time we were talking about the importance of regularly reciting the Quran and having a relationship with the Quran. And the topic that Imam al-Haddad, again, we're going through this book, the Book of Assistance, by the great scholar and knower of Allah, Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad. One of the things that he has mentioned to us up till this point is the importance of consistent acts of worship in order to improve your spirituality, in order to improve your iman and to improve your yaqeen and your knowledge of Allah. You have to do acts consistently. You and I cannot just do things one-off. And very similar to kind of going to the gym, in order to actually see results, you have to go consistently. In order to be a healthy person, you have to eat good food consistently. You can't, just have a healthy meal every now and then every other day just eat French fries and cookies and expect to actually be fit. Similarly with spirituality, you and I cannot only just have small periods of time where we might be more deeply spiritually engaged and then just fall off on the other days. We have to consistently be doing things and be doing extra things. And so we started covering this idea of a wird, of having a regular practice that we do in addition to the 5 daily prayers. So the absolute most important thing for the Muslim to get down is the 5 daily prayers at the beginning in their time, and then in the earliest part of the time is also the goal. So it comes in a hadith where one of the best actions that you can do is prayer at the beginning of its time or at the earlier part of its time. And so we should aim to not only get consistent in our prayers, but also start to then get to them by doing them earlier and earlier. If Dhuhr has a window of, let's say right now it's coming in at 1 p.m. and in most of the madhabs, the Asr is coming in about 4:05. We shouldn't pray Dhuhr at 3:40 or 3:50. We should be praying Dhuhr at 1 o'clock. Or 1:20, 1:30, 2 o'clock, let's say, right? We should be trying to pray in the earlier half. As an example of somebody who is trying to go to greater limits in order to increase their iman, in order to increase their spirituality. So what we specifically talked about last time is we talked about this idea of how to have a connection with the Quran, and what the importance of having a connection with the Quran. And Imam Haddad, he laid out a couple of different areas that we should have a connection. So I'll just quickly review them. He said first is that everybody should have these 5 things down, and regularly they should be doing these every day. You should have a portion of the Quran that you do what's called tilawa, what you do just recitation. So you start with Fatiha and Surah Baqarah, and you work your way through the entire Quran in some increments of time. Ideally, he recommended you get to the point where you're doing it once a month. But if you can even do so every few months, that's still good, or even once a year or twice a year, it's still good. But you work through the entire Quran where you recite it end to end in Arabic. So that is one wird that everybody should have, one regular, consistent spiritual practice that everybody should have. And with it results a certain type of spiritual light that will assist you in your affairs and your activities. So the way our deen works is that you have unseen assistance, something called madad, that you get as you start to do more and more actions. And you will get spiritual assistance by opening up different types of doors, which will result in different types of spiritual lights, which will then assist you, and you will have angels assisting you in the unseen with your tasks and with your affairs and with every other thing that you have going on without you even realizing it, because you are starting to do not only what Allah has commanded you to do, but now you are starting to follow what the Prophet ﷺ used to do. And you are starting to get it in alignment with his sunnah. And there's various hadiths that prove the points that I just mentioned, but for the sake of brevity, we'll try to keep going. Then you have, in addition to regular recitation, you have some portion of time which should be spent reading the Quran and studying the commentary and understanding the meaning of the Quran. So this should ideally be in your own language, right? So the Arabic recitation was called tilawa, will be, of course, in Arabic. And for those who Arabic is not their native tongue, then the time when you spent trying to understand the Quran, in addition to, of course, spending time learning Arabic, which we might get to a little bit of that today, we should have some time where we just spend learning what does the Quran mean? What does it mean when Allah tells the Bani Israel to sacrifice a baqarah, to sacrifice a cow? What exactly does that mean? And when they refuse to do so, or when they ask question upon question upon question about the type of cow, what do the commentators say about that, right? What does the tafsir say about that? You spend time learning about these things that on initial read, it might not really mean much. It might just be like, okay, this group of people, they just ask a lot of questions. But like, what exactly is it that they are trying to do, right? Why are they so reluctant to obey the command of Allah? Whereas you see the Sahaba, as you see at the end of Surah, in the last verses of Surah Baqarah, that they say, Sami'na wa ata'na, we hear and we obey. That is what the people who are close to Allah, they hear and they obey. You might question to clarify later. Definitely don't ask these arrogant questions of why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do that? As just an example of as you dive into the commentary, you and I will start to learn. The third step, in addition then to having a relationship with the meanings of the Quran, is to have a relationship with reflecting on those meanings. So you might read the meaning that one of the great people of tafsir, that one of them might have said, right? And the meaning might come from some of the earlier generations, from the Salaf. You might, though, contemplate a verse, and you might get an additional meaning from that verse because of the reflection that you do. The Quran is limitless in its meanings. It's limitless in its meaning. So reflecting on the Quran is important, and we specifically identified last time that we should have a portion of time every week where we take a verse and we just sit with it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and specifically the verses that will bring about the remembrance of the afterlife and the grandeur of Allah, because you will start to then realize all this stuff is petty. Everything we get caught up in the world is very, very petty. But sometimes we read the Quran and there's these like intense, amazing verses that are talking about how Allah has angels that are circling His throne, and how Allah will take all of the heavens and the earth he'll roll them up into His hand in no anthropomorphic way. We're talking in a figurative way. He might mention this as a verse, and we just read across that verse and like we just keep going, not really thinking like how serious this might be, right? What exactly could this mean? So that's where the reflection component comes in. When somebody reflects, something gets deeply embedded inside of them. And when something gets deeply embedded inside of you, you will see that when you interact with other people in society, you interact with other things, that meaning you had reflected on will come back and will guide you to what's the right action in that situation. And we'll get to that in the whole section that he has on reflection, which is coming up in the next 2 or 3 lessons. So it's tilawa, regular recitation. It's reading in your language and ideally with a commentary. It is reflecting on it. And then we should have a portion where we memorize some portion of Quran, right? And so I think we mentioned last time that all of us should aspire to have at least the 30th juz, what's called juz amma, right? The final juz of the Quran memorized. And it's something we can all work through. That we want to get to a point as Muslims where we're going beyond just knowing a few short surahs, and we always recite the short surahs. And if we know the longer surahs, we should refresh our memory and recite the longer surahs in our prayer. There's more reward for reciting more Quran. That should be like, something that we start to practice. And one of the benefits of praying in the masjid, right? And there'll be a whole section on this as well, that you start to, of course, the imam, generally speaking, will not just be reciting Qul huwallahu ahad, Qul a'udhu birabbil falaq, or someone from the congregation will tell the imam, let me lead, or let someone else lead, right? You'll generally see that they're reciting from the longer surahs of the Quran in order to help build a deeper relationship. And then finally, there's implementing, right? Which in all of this, none of it's, if you do all of it, but you don't implement the Quran, it's not going to be of benefit. You have to implement what the verses say, right? So we want to be people who are careful not just to learn things so that we can discuss them and have intricate discussions. Like, oh, did you hear, the Bani Israel used to do this and this fiqh ruling on this issue and this issue. And then it's like, we miss all of our prayers. But we know all this like knowledge. It's because knowledge has a risk to it as well, which we'll talk about inshallah, that it actually just makes you think you know a lot, and it becomes a topic of conversation, and also sometimes a little bit of boasting, where look at how much I know, look at how much I know, but like the implementation is not happening, right? And so we want to avoid that. And they say the Sahaba, there was actually few huffaz amongst the Sahaba. And the reason was that they did not necessarily memorize the entire Quran, because they would spend time with every single verse, making sure they implemented the verse before they moved on to the next section or the next surah. That was their type of relationship with the Quran as it's mentioned in the books. So that was the first section we covered of the importance of having regular recitation. The second portion then is the consistent surahs, which the Prophet ﷺ, the Salaf, the Sahaba and the Salaf would encourage us to do regularly. There were 3 that we should do on a daily basis, and 3 that we should, and then 1 that we should at least do on a weekly basis. Does anybody remember the 3 that we should be aiming to do every day? And aspiring, it doesn't mean we start with it, but Surah Al-Mulk, and what time of day should we do Surah Al-Mulk? In the evening. So in the hadith, after Isha is when you aim to do Surah Al-Mulk. And does anyone remember the benefits of doing Surah Al-Mulk after Isha? Of reciting it. Yes. Protection in the grave, exactly. Surah Mulk will intercede for you in the grave. The punishments of the grave, and we ask Allah that He protect us and our families, our loved ones, and all of the ummah from any punishment in the grave. But if the punishments in the grave begin, Surah Al-Mulk emerges and starts to fight for you and starts to protect you. These things have a spiritual reality. These are the friends you and I will have in the grave. None of our other friends will be there with us. That much is clear. Doesn't mean we become antisocial in this life and say, hey, I don't want to be your friend. You're not going to be with me in the grave. That's not what we're saying. But in general, our good deeds will be our companions in the grave. So the Surah Al-Mulk, and then there were 2 others. Does anybody remember? That ideally, the spiritual aspirant that we should try as we're getting closer and closer to start to recite these on a daily basis. Surah Waqia. Yeah, Surah Waqia. And that, does anybody remember the time we should recite Surah Waqia and the benefit of it? Between Maghrib and Isha, yep. So either after Asr or after Maghrib. Comes in a hadith that after Maghrib, and some say that the evening begins after Asr, and so after Asr, but after Asr, after Maghrib. And the benefit of that is the one who recites it will be protected from poverty, and the intention should be made to have an increase in both your spiritual rizq, your spiritual sustenance, and your dunya sustenance, and your, it's a good risk, good for job-related issues and things like that, career, income, that type of thing. And does anybody remember the final one, which should ideally be for Fajr? It's also known as the heart of the Quran. Surah Yasin. Right? Surah Yasin, ideally. So you generally would see that Surah Yasin as one that a lot of Muslims have memorized. And then Surah Mulk also, it comes in hadith that the Prophet ﷺ wished we would all have this in our hearts. And so we're in the month of the Prophet ﷺ, we're in the blessed month of Rabi al-Awwal. One thing we should take away is one sunnah that we can implement consistently, and what would we rather do in this month and make the Prophet ﷺ happy. If he said he wished that we should have a surah in the heart of every believer, then we should leave this month having that surah in our heart, because one of our goals is to try to bring happiness to Sayyidina Rasulullah ﷺ. That should be among the goals of the believers. So Surah Yasin after Fajr ideally, Surah Waqia after Asr, after Maghrib, and there's like time to do it. Doesn't mean it has to be right after. And Surah Mulk after Isha. And the recommendation was that we work our way up to it. We don't start all 3 on one day and then do it for 2 days and then get exhausted and never do it again for 2 years. We just take one, we do it slow, we implement, and then we do the next and we implement. But once it becomes consistent, you're talking 3 to 5 minutes in the morning, 2 to 3 minutes in the evening, and 3 to 4 minutes in the like after Isha at nighttime. It becomes very, very straightforward because someone just has it down, right? And that's a quick recitation. If there's recitation with tadabbur and the reflection, that would of course take longer, and that's what we want to aspire to. And the core theme, all these surahs, they mention death often. And so if we do reflect on them, we will then regularly reflect on death often. It's one of the main lessons we take away, that the Muslims actually reminding themselves of death a lot, because this is a very, very short life. Yes, Sidi.
What was the benefit of Yasin?
The benefit of Yasin, it comes in various narrations that the one who recites Surah Yasin, just pulling up the hadith. hadith here. Whoever reads Surah Yasin at the beginning of the day, it will assist with their needs being fulfilled. And then there's another narration, Yasin is read for its intention. Yeah. The hadith here, as mentioned, the narrations are weak, but it is permissible to take weak hadith for virtuous things, for fadail al-a'mal. Yeah. Okay, so that's on just what we were talking about last time, just a review, right, on the relationship with the Quran and doing things regularly in terms of having that relationship. Anybody have any questions or clarifications on that before we move on to the importance of consistently seeking knowledge? Okay, so let's get to the next section then. So then in the next chapter, Imam Haddad, he mentions, and by the way, the book for those who are joining now, we're going through is the Book of Assistance by Imam Abdullah bin Alwi al-Haddad. There were a few copies, I think, still left over in the masjid. We had passed some out, but it's, you can order it on Amazon for like 10, 11 if you're interested in having the book. And we're basically just taking, it's already very, very distilled down. Each chapter is like 2 pages, and he's really just broken everything down that you need to do from A to Z in your life in order to get to become or get to the highest levels of nearness to Allah, the things a believer needs to be doing. And so we're just taking portions from the book. So the next section that he mentions is acquiring knowledge. And he says that everybody should have a wird or a regular litany of reading useful knowledge in some consistent basis, right? And again, here, consistency is kind of up to you and your schedule and what you can do with it. These are not like, with the exception of our Fard al-Ain knowledges, which we like have to learn as soon as we hit puberty. In general, other knowledge, we try to come up with a level of consistency that we can practice it with. So don't worry if you can't do something every day. It doesn't mean you leave it entirely. Once a week is better than never. 2 times a week or once a month is still better than, never doing it or only doing it, let's say, in Ramadan, right? So we just want to come up with a consistent practice. So he mentions that the definition of knowledge, and this is a really, really important definition. And you'll see here all of the scholars that are the true, what are called the ulama al-amilin, the ulama of the hereafter. All of them have the same definitions for these things. And it's all, they're all from the same, they have the same source, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then you'll see scholars who have generally speaking, or people who have generally strayed from the sunnah, they will have various meanings. And amongst them, you'll see lots of debate and constant argumentation about what does this mean, but you'll generally see that there is a beauty, and it doesn't mean there wasn't difference of opinion in our tradition, but there was a beauty in like everybody kind of understood this is what's meant by knowledge. So Imam Haddad, he clarifies what's meant by knowledge. He says knowledge is that which increases your knowledge of the essence of Allah, the essence of God, his attributes, and makes you aware of his commands. That's the first definition of knowledge. Anything that's not helping you do that, that's not making you really deeply get closer and closer to understanding Allah and start to understand what does God want from you. He wants something in general from every one of us, and then he wants something specific from each one of us. There's generalities that he wants from all the Muslims and frankly all of creation, and then there's specificities which he wants from each of us that he created that he'll inspire us to understand as we go throughout our life. And so it makes you aware of him and makes you aware of his attributes and his commands. What does that mean, his attributes? An example here that you could be going through a very tough period in your life. And you might think that, oh, God, if I'm going through a tough time, it must mean that God is upset with me. Because why else would I be going through a tough time? If God has all control and I'm obeying him, then that must mean that if he has all control and I'm obeying him, that he must make things easy for me if I'm kind of in a good rank with him. Right? That would be like, especially in the era that we live in, many times that is the Christian view, the kind of prosperity gospel type of view. But somebody who's learned about how what's called the sunnah of Allah, what's called the pattern of Allah, will not have that understanding. And so when they look at Allah's attributes, they'll be like, well, there's many attributes. We know 99 names, just the 99 names. There's many, many, many more names than that as well. And there's many attributes that Allah has. So they might say, oh, I'm going through a tough time. Well, perhaps Allah's name, Al-Jabbar, the compeller, is manifesting in my life. Perhaps when I go through an easy time, his name, Al-Latif, the subtle, kind one, is manifesting in my life. Perhaps his name, Ash-Shakur, the grateful one, is manifesting in my life. And so on. And so there's so many different names, but they're not all names of ease. They're not, every name is not Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, but he does begin with Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. He begins with most merciful, most compassionate. So generally speaking, at the end of the day, it will be mercy upon mercy upon mercy, inshallah. But generally speaking, a lot of that mercy is reserved for the next life. And when we really, really, really need it. In this life, Allah is very merciful with us, and we are still tested. And the test is a part of the mercy. But the reason I mention this is because when someone begins to understand and seek knowledge more, they begin to understand in every part of their life, oh, a different attribute of Allah is manifesting in my life today. It's not always going to be the same. If it was the same, how would you get to know God? Because he doesn't only have one attribute. He's not like you and me might only have a few sides to us. God has many, 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 many attributes, and he wants us to develop knowledge of him in many, 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 many ways. And so that would be an example here of how knowledge should be helping you, right? The next thing he says is that knowledge should lead you to renounce the things of this dunya. You shouldn't desire deep down inside. As you learn more of what's called true sacred knowledge, you should stop desiring dunya all the time. I want this car, I want this giant house, I want this. It doesn't mean that it's haram to have those things. That's not what he's saying. But he's saying it will stop making you chase after. That should stop being your end goal in life. You should know what your end goal is, that's the third piece. It says true knowledge will help you yearn for the hereafter. And only you will know that this is happening. People will start to see manifestation of this behavior, but you will know if you are actually hoping and waiting for the hereafter. You will know that that is the end goal of the believer. You live in this world, but you are as though you are a stranger, right? As it comes in the hadith. It's not supposed to be the permanent abode. If someone goes to the airport and they're waiting for the flight, you don't see them start to build a house and start to do all of these different things to establish their full presence at the airport. Probably get kicked out if you did, but you generally don't see that. The Muslim you're just in transit. Doesn't mean we don't live in the world, but your mind can be, let's say, here, but your heart is with Allah. You got to do what you got to do. We got to go to work. We got to earn income. We have to live. We have to have cars. We have to do all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's okay, well, this is not the whole goal of my life. And the more somebody seeks true knowledge, the more they're drawn away from this life and the more that they're drawn towards the next life. And the way to evaluate this is when you see other people doing things and getting dunya, how much does your heart, and again, only you will know this because very few people admit this, how much does it hurt when you see, oh, this person has this huge house and maybe I'm still living in, a one bedroom. Do you oh, I don't really care. I mean, it's just a house, right? Is that the feeling? Or is it oh my God, what do they do? How do they get this house? What's going on? Oh my God, and you actually start feeling envy towards them and you're they're not even that much smarter than me. And how do they get all this place? Well, what would happen? So they drive a really nice car and we're still driving our car from college. And we're how much does it hurt inside? Because you might be yeah, I don't mind having nice things. It would be nice to have a little bit of a nicer car. But are you tripping off it? Does it really, really get to you? That's how you evaluate where you and I are at with regards to desiring the hereafter. And then especially if family members start to get things and whatnot, how much do you wonder, why do they have this? Why do they have this? Why do they have this? If somebody has that, it's a deep, deep, deep sickness that you're constantly questioning, why does somebody else have something and I do not, right? And it shows that we have very much a deep attachment to the dunya and we have a lot of work to do on our spirituality. Because ultimately we shouldn't question what Allah has given somebody else. Right? His decision. He's God, not me. He can give anybody whatever he wants. And he'll ask them if he wants to, and he doesn't have to, right? But that's where the yearning deep down inside, doesn't mean we can't have it, but the yearning deep down inside shouldn't be there. Yes?
And we're not truly a believer until we love our neighbors. So we're supposed to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. So if we really love our neighbors, we happy for them.
Right. And so there's...
If your daughter gets a nice house with a swimming pool, you're happy for your daughter. So we want to love everyone.
Right. And so we should love other people and what they have and not have this kind of envious type of approach. But knowledge will start to clean all this stuff inside of us. because it'll reorient. And the crazy thing when somebody learns is just through the act of learning itself, purification is happening. You don't even know. You might not realize it all. It does not require the level of intellectual understanding. Knowledge is a spiritual, this is a spiritual science we're talking about. The Prophet ﷺ learned everything without formally studying everything. Because what you're seeing there, the first revelation that came to him, Iqra, right? And he's commanded to read and commanded to recite. And then all of a sudden, all of these knowledges just enter him. So you see their knowledge is a spiritual phenomenon. It's not only an intellectual phenomenon. We have to grapple with it because we are not the Prophet ﷺ, right? And we're not from the ranks of the awliya there is this type of what's called ilham, inspired knowledge that can come, like it came to Sayyidina Khidr alayhi salam in Surah Kahf. But generally speaking, knowledge has a spiritual effect to it. And that's where we have to distinguish it. You can't learn these knowledges in a secular university setting. Secular university setting, we'll learn academic knowledge, but we won't learn like spiritual knowledge. They won't be preparing us how to get prepared for the hereafter. You might have a teacher teaching Islam who doesn't even believe in God. That happened to me. My teacher, I remember in university for Near Eastern Studies, and he was teaching religion. I'm pretty sure he was an atheist, and he just didn't believe in God at all. But he had so much information. That's actually that's the distinguishing factor. It's called information. It's not called knowledge. Knowledge is when information becomes practically implemented in your life, and it actually starts to change you. That's knowledge. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of facts and figures. And it's really of little benefit. You can have a PhD and as many PhDs as somebody wants. And if they don't believe in Allah, it's not going to benefit them, right? What benefit will the PhD have? And if they believe in Allah, if they don't have a PhD, it also doesn't matter because they're going to, inshallah, if they're implementing everything that they learn, they'll have that. And if they believe in Allah and they have all these outward degrees and they're using them in the right way, subhanAllah, then you'll see the thirst and the love for knowledge that comes with. And then the fourth thing he says that it does is it shows you your faults. True knowledge shows you your faults. You'll start to be like, oh God, this book is really just it's exposing me, right? You'll read the book and you'll walk away. Like if you read the books of Imam al-Ghazali, you walk away scared just a little bit scared. You're like, this is real. Because he shakes you. He calls you out in a way that's like, wake up, the hereafter is coming, you could die tomorrow, and if you don't wake up, like how are you gonna answer God? And he makes you feel the immediacy of things. It doesn't mean we should run away from those things. It means that when we read them, we just are aware that that's what these scholars are trying to do. Because when the Sahaba would sit with the Prophet ﷺ, they would feel hope, but they would also feel fear. They would feel fear. They would feel the reality. The day of judgment they would act as though the day of judgment was coming. When the hadith was mentioned about hypocrisy and about the hellfire, Sayyidina Omar would wonder, he would ask Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman, who was given the secrets of who the hypocrites were. He would ask him, he would go to him, and so the Prophet ﷺ had passed away at this point, ﷺ. He would go to him and say, am I from the hypocrites? Tell me, am I from the hypocrites? Amir al-Mu'mineen, of course you're not from the hypocrites. Yeah, he's clarifying these. He's trying to figure out that they wouldn't even assume much of themselves, even though he said Omar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu an, of what is his rank. But that was the presence and the awareness of like their own inner states, and then what's going to come on the day of judgment. And so finally, that this knowledge on this point, knowledge is going to change you, and the knowledge will start to have effects on changing. There's an alchemy going on, right? Imam Ghazali has a book called The Alchemy of Happiness, and as you read the book, there's an alchemy that's going on inside of you. So all the things that Imam Haddad is mentioning with the different awrad, the different regular things we should be doing, it's also you can transform and have spiritual alchemy go on inside. Quran will have one effect. Dhikr will have another effect. Knowledge will have a very, very, very powerful effect, especially in our time. Reflection will have another effect. Of course, the prayers and the foundations and the fard will have their own effect, the most important, right? And then until 3-4 years, someone does this every single day, and boom, they're completely transformed. They will just be they will be completely different than the person that they used to be because the alchemy has taken place. Alchemy is known as like the kind of art of transforming lead into gold. So you're transforming, right, into spiritual gold. So the reason why knowledge is so important, in addition to what we just mentioned, those are the benefits of knowledge. Now we get into why is learning knowledge important. it should be sufficient that it was the first thing that was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, right? And then it should also be sufficient that is what differentiated Adam alayhi salam when Allah says, وَأَلَّمَ الْآدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, that we taught Adam the names of all things. It's not just referring to this is a minbar and this is a table. No, it's the inner meanings and the secrets of things were taught to Adam alayhi salam, amongst what some of the commentators say, right? So again, knowledge then is differentiated him from the angels. The angel said, Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma alamtana, that they're saying to Allah, glory be to you, we have no knowledge except that which you have taught us. As they're perplexed over when they ask him, how would you create a creation that is going to sow corruption on the earth and spread blood, right, and shed blood? And he says, I know what you know not. Again, knowledge. And then he teaches Adam the names of all things. And then the angels say, Subhanaka la ilma lana, we don't know except that which you have taught us. Knowledge. That's what's differentiating Adam alayhi salam. It's what differentiates the human being from the animals, right? The animals in most ways are stronger. There's animals that are stronger than the human being. There's animals that can eat more than the human being. There's animals that can run faster than the human being. There's animals that can copulate faster than the human being or more than the human being. Every single other act that we can do, there is another animal in Allah's animal kingdom that can do things that we cannot do, except knowledge. There's nobody who can learn like the human being can learn. There's nobody who can completely get spiritual awareness of Allah in the way that the human being can get awareness of Allah. And this is what distinguishes the human being. So learning was one of the first commandments. And then as Allah mentions in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that we only created mankind and jinn to worship. And as Ibn Abbas, the famous commentator, says, it actually means لِيَعْرِفُونَ, in order to know. That's the goal of your creation, is to know Allah. And so you and I don't want to leave this world knowing chemistry and biology and mathematics and English and U.S. history, pre-Civil War and post-Civil War and modern era and linguistics and computer science and Java and JavaScript and HTML and all the different things that we can know, and we don't know Allah. It's a waste of a life. And we spend years on our secular education, years. And then we don't, when someone's like, wants to spend like an hour or two on the religion, everyone's like, whoa, don't go. Are you sure about that? Right? We barely invest time in learning about our religion. The difference between us and the people of the past and the past generations, their life was devoted to learning and devotion. That's what they would do in their extra time. They would earn a living. They would have shops. They would be business people. They would do all these things. There would be doctors amongst them and people who were helping amongst them, amongst the men and the women. They would be doing all these things, but in their extra time, they weren't watching Netflix. They weren't scrolling social media. They weren't doing all these things that we do. They had time with each other to build brotherhood and sisterhood, and then their goal was to know Allah. Extra time was doing. If you ever sit with a scholar, if we're blessed to ever sit with the scholars, you'll see how they fill their time. It's just book after book after book. You walk into the office of a scholar and it's just books, and then they're doing this, and then they're teaching, and then they're preparing some presentation, and then they have to counsel people, and so, and then but it's always in something else. That doesn't mean our life becomes, we're not scholars. We have to live we have other things to do, but we can have a portion of that, maybe 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day. That's the goal, is to make it consistent. But it's to know that what we want to aspire to, so that we can start with the basics. And the desire for knowledge can become so powerful in somebody that it actually exceeds the desire for everything else. It can become stronger than sexual desire. There's 5 to 7 types of desires. You have, amongst the strongest is the sexual desire in the human being, and the desire for food. Those are the 2 strongest appetites. Then you have the desire for wealth, big desire, right? Then you have the desire for fame, right? Rich and famous, as people say. Then you have the desire for power. The desire for power, if you have power, many times you don't even need all the other things, because you just have power. And many times the people in power will have gone to extremes in all the other desires I just mentioned as they were on their journey to power. And then, like the governor of New York, they'll fall because they'll get exposed, right? That generally tends to happen. But amongst all those desires, one of the desires that's even stronger than that, it's called the good desire, is the desire for knowledge. Because the thirst, you just can't fill it. You just always want to learn, always want to learn, always want to learn, right? And you have to sometimes balance. No, I got other things I have to do. But that's how strong the desire for knowledge can become. And so the Prophet ﷺ said that there is a time that's coming that there will be the people of insight will be few, the orators, those who talk, right, will be many, and there will be few people who are kind of helping each other. And he said at this time, seeking knowledge will be superior to extra ibadah, right? And I'm very much paraphrasing the hadith here, but what does that mean? That in the time of the Sahaba, people generally speaking, as we mentioned, had a yearning for the hereafter. That was very much established. When you read the different hadith, you'd see the majority of the Sahaba, they would spend their extra time in extra acts of devotion, extra acts of nafil prayer, extra acts of reciting the Quran, extra acts of dhikr, of reflection, and so on and so forth. But the Prophet ﷺ said that a time is coming when spending your extra time, you do the fard, you do the basics that we're talking about, and a few of the extra things, and then you spend the majority of your extra time in learning, because of how much ignorance there will be in that time and how few people will actually know. And how you might not even be able to trust somebody who says that they know, right? And a statement of Ibn Abbas, he said that studying knowledge is more beloved than remaining the entire night. Studying knowledge for a part of the night is more beloved and than to him than remaining in devotion, right, in tahajjud prayer, qiyam, for the entire night. And there's many other statements. It comes in another narration in the Ihya al-Ulumuddin that attending a gathering of knowledge is better than praying 1,000 rakahs, or visiting 1,000 sick people, or attending 1,000 funerals. These are actions we do, and they're fard kifaya actions, communal obligations to attend the funerals, visit the sick, and so on and so forth. But he's showing the supremacy of seeking knowledge, why it's so important. And so when you go to traditional Muslim societies which still have the sunnah in place today, you'll see that like gatherings of dhikr and knowledge are like everywhere. It's just generally speaking, they're happening all the time. And then in the societies where there's a lot of heedlessness, there's very few gatherings of dhikr and knowledge, and there's a lot of gatherings of everything else, partying and this and that, and let's let the amount of time people are spending just socializing, and then socializing with haram associated with it, drinking and smoking and so on and so forth, and then just kind of wasting time and not actually doing things that are of benefit. And so these are let me just pause here before we get to this next section, and then we'll end. Does anybody have questions on what we've covered thus far? Now he's going to lay out the types of knowledge that everybody should know. Yes.
So I know there's a balance, obviously, but so given what you said about the superiority of knowledge, then say you have a given chunk of time, 2-3 hours, you're better off devoting that to learning or reading Islamic knowledge than to stand in prayer or tahajjud.
So good question. The question was, if somebody has a couple hours, are they better off seeking knowledge than to stand in, let's say, qiyam, tahajjud, or do extra acts of worship? I believe it's the saying of Imam Malik, rahimahullah, that he said, basically, don't leave devotion entirely for seeking knowledge, and don't leave seeking knowledge entirely for devotion. You should have a balance of the two. Because again, each of them has a certain light associated with it. So if somebody had the himma for 2 or 3 hours to do multiple things, it would be advised that they spend a portion of that time in prayer, and then they spend a larger portion of that time learning. If they have the himma to learn. Sometimes someone can only learn for 10-20 minutes and they're like, I can't do anymore. But they can do a lot of dhikr. Or they can only do 10 minutes of dhikr, and they can also only do 10 minutes of knowledge, and then they need to just relax. They might not be able to do, you know what I mean? Everybody has a different level of how much their nafs can handle. The goal is you stretch and stretch and stretch the nafs until it gets to the point where it starts to enjoy these things. If you have not learned your fard ayn, meaning you do not know the detailed breakdown of the prayer, the rulings of wudu, the rulings of prayer, what constitutes forgetfulness in prayer, what constitutes a wajib act in prayer, and so on and so forth. And same thing with fasting, zakat, hajj. And let's say somebody is starting a business, it becomes fard to learn the rulings of business. Someone's getting married, it becomes fard to learn the rulings of marriage and the rulings of divorce. So if you don't have those down, then it's you have to learn those over the extra ibadah. It would be a misprioritization for you to go through nafil ibadah and not know those fard ayn, if that makes sense. right? But if someone has the fard ayn down, then you're talking about other actions that you can do, other types of knowledge that you can gain, and that's where the balance should come. Because much of the knowledge has to be implemented, and it's implemented when you're doing the ibadah, if that makes sense. So like you might learn a hadith about the importance of giving charity. But you can't just learn that hadith, you have to go and then give charity at some point, right? Or go and, so there's a hadith about feeding people, where you have to go and make food or buy food and then feed the people and implement the knowledge, if that makes sense. So there is that balance, and that's why knowledge is not just theoretical, right? The difference is if somebody is an alim, a scholar, and they're significantly involved in writing and teaching, this is what they do, you'll generally see that for them, they're spending a larger portion in learning, yeah, because that's like, they have to do that, and that's their route, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question? Yeah. And there's no one formula for everybody. It's going to be kind of, you'll know individually what works and what doesn't. Yeah. Any other questions on this section? So he mentions then, we're going to mention the three most critical parts of knowledge that everybody has to learn. So your fard ayn, these are called individual obligations. This is like, by the time we are what's called baligh, we've hit puberty, we have to know these things. And many times we don't, and it's okay, we have to just learn them at some point. It is every believer has to have their aqidah down, number one, their creed. What does the Muslim believe? And ideally, somebody should go through a text where they just study their creed. And this is not complicated, but they should sit with a scholar and go through a text. If they don't do that, at least knowing the core essence of your creed is important, right? So like this, what I mean here is that we believe in Allah, we believe in the last day, we believe in the angels, we believe in the books, we believe in the prophets, right? We believe in Allah's oneness. We don't believe that Allah has hands and feet and so on and so forth. We don't believe that, right? We believe that Allah is all-encompassing and all-knowing. We know that we will be held to account, that we will be taken to account. What does it mean for the Day of Judgment? We believe in that. We believe in the life in the grave. All those types of things. And a lot of this we might have heard growing up. Sometimes it is important, though, for at least a couple hours to sit with somebody and just learn the core aspects, to just bring it all together. And this doesn't need to be like really, really complicated. Aqidah can be learned very, very quickly. But that would be one of the first, what's called fard ayn knowledges. And there's a book that's been translated in English. It's the second book of Imam al-Ghazali's Ahya. It's on creed. And he just lays out, like, here's everything you need to believe, what you need to know. And then you just read it, and you're like, okay, did I get this down? And it has a little bit of explanation there. And then if you can study it with a teacher, that's ideal. But at the very minimum, we should have that down. And this is, by the way, it's very difficult to derive all of this purely from, like, you can derive it from the Quran, but we're not that level. Like, we're not at that level where we can drive. You need to go to a book that a scholar has written that has consolidated everything the Prophet ﷺ, everything Allah has said, everything the Prophet ﷺ has said, and then said this is what's called the belief of Ahl al-Sunnah wa Jama'ah, which is the belief of the Sunni Muslims, right? Let's say that if someone is Sunni, of course, that would be, right? That's important to know. The next type of knowledge that's important to know is fiqh, and this is what's called the jurisprudence, laws for how to do things, what you can do, the knowledge of halal and haram. Now, this is important, but in our time, people think this is all knowledge. This is really, really, really a significant problem. And Imam Ghazali just calls the scholars out left and right for thinking this is all knowledge. Knowledge is not limited to the knowledge of halal and haram. That's a portion of knowledge. That's a portion of knowledge. And many Muslims are pushed away, especially in our time today, especially amongst our younger brothers and sisters, because they just think Islam is all halal and haram. It's actually not that much about Islam that's halal and haram. But if we learn growing up everything is halal and haram, and nobody talks about love and about the tasting of nearness to the Prophet ﷺ and the tasting of nearness to the awliya and so on and so forth, we think that everything is about halal and haram and rules and right and wrong. That's not the limit. But that is a very crucial aspect. It guides us, and we have to know what's halal and what's haram so we don't go astray. Right? We can't go on the other end of I don't want to learn any rules. I'm just spiritual. I'm such a spiritual person. I don't want to learn any rules. And then we just go completely astray. So what's required here is for somebody to know at minimum the detailed rules of wudu, prayer, fasting, zakat, and hajj, the pillars. And then, as I mentioned, once you are in a state where, let's say, you're getting married, you have to know the rules of marriage and the rules of divorce. And when someone is starting a business and so on and so forth, every decision somebody takes in life, they have to know, what does Allah have to say about this, right? What do Allah and His Messenger have to say about this? This can be done. Ideally, it is done, and this is the dominant opinion. This is the dominant opinion of the Muslims, is that it is wajib, obligatory for the Muslim to follow a madhab in Islam. A madhab in Islam. There are 4 traditional madhab. Hanafi school, the most widespread school. The Shafi school, the Maliki school, and the Hanbali school. Those are the 4 madhabs that the Ummah agreed upon. There were many, many, many other madhabs. Sufyan al-Thawri had a madhab, as an example, and many of the other scholars had madahib, but these are the 4 that the Ummah united upon. And you'll have people in today's day and age who don't understand the deen say, oh, but this wasn't around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and so on. There were so many things that were not around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The word tafsir was not used at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Tajweed was not a science. The ba and ta and tha that you read in the Quran, the dots, as Sundiata was saying in the khutbah the other day, were not around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Many of the fatha, dhamma, and kasra were not around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Hijri calendar was not around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran actually compiled in the order that it's compiled in as a formal book that we read was not around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. We could just give a whole talk just on this, because that is not an argument. It's not an argument. The madahib are the understanding of what's called someone who has reached the station of mujtahid mutlaq, which means that they have mastered all of the foundational and preliminary sciences, and then they've mastered essentially all the other sciences you need to master. They've mastered the hadith, they've mastered the Quran, to the best of a human's ability, of course. And then they say, this is now my understanding of what the Prophet, Allah and His Messenger are saying about this ruling, right? And then the madhab is a school. It's not one person. So they'll say, you can't just follow one person. You're not following a person. You're following the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. That's what a madhab is. But the reason why it's important is because there are things that have difference of opinion. And you have to make sure that you don't just pick and choose, right? I'm going to take this today. I'm going to take this today. I'm going to take this today. And you just kind of create your own version of the deen, if that makes sense. So it is usually a school of fiqh. And of course, the majority of us, whatever way we're praying, it's valid according to some rule of fiqh, right? Like we're valid according to some rule of fiqh. But it's important to know what we have to do, and what are the requirements, what are the wajibat of the prayer in accordance of the rules of fiqh, and the sunnah of the prayer, and so on and so forth. So that's the knowledge of fiqh, and that can literally be learned in like a weekend course with in any local place that's offered, or there's classes online. Somebody just says, okay, I'm going to study, and they'll study a simple text that lays out everything we need to know. And there'll be parts of it that you don't you're not going to use them every day in your life. Like, for example, wudu. We can make wudu in the Hanafi school. You can make wudu with many types of water, ocean water being amongst those, right? But we kind of live by the ocean, but we're not going there all the time. But if you ever are there, you'll know, it's valid for me to make wudu with ocean or in the river water. But you don't have to have every single fact of that absolutely memorized, but it's good for you to know and have awareness. That's what the books will get into that as an example, right? And by the way, fiqh, many times it can be dry. And as I mentioned last time, some parts of spirituality can be boring. They're not always the most fun. But you have to go through the dry periods in order to experience the beautiful periods. You have to know the rules in order to understand and experience the tasting. Ultimately, that's one of the things that ends up happening. Is someone starts to really feel the sakina and the internal tranquility and the fruits of the faith. But it have to be confined within the rules. And then the third knowledge that's important to learn is the knowledge of spirituality, the knowledge of what's formally called tasawwuf. This traditionally is translated as the knowledge of Sufism, or the knowledge of, and many people in our time don't like that word, same group that doesn't like madhabs, but it is the knowledge of tazkiyat al-nafs, purifying the soul. The goal of the Muslim, قَدْ أَفْلَهَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. That's the most important verse, one of the most important verses that elucidates this point, right? That successful is the one who has purified themselves, and destroyed is the one who isn't. So it is a fard for the Muslims to learn the diseases of the heart, spiritual disease of the heart, and the good traits of the heart. You have to know that I have a disease of the heart. Somebody could die with a major disease of the heart and not even know that they had the disease of envy inside them the whole time. And Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith that envy burns good deeds like fire burns wood. So you see somebody and you're just like envious. Why do they have this? What we were talking about earlier. And the good deeds are just getting burned away and you're not even saying anything. You're just thinking it. That's what a disease of the heart can do. That's why it's one of the reasons why it's hard to learn. So you learn about what are the diseases of the heart, and envy, anger, jealousy, love of the dunya, and there's many other diseases. A good book that clarifies these is a book by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, that purification of the heart. Pride, as an example, pride, arrogance, conceit, being full of yourself, and so on and so forth. And then it's required to know what those diseases are, whatever somebody wants to call it, whether it was traditionally for over 1,200 years in our religion, that's science. There's a science, just like tafsir has a science associated with it, fiqh has a science associated with it, tajweed has a science associated with it. You do these things and this will happen. That science was called Sufism in our religion. Up until about the late 1800s, some people had problems with that term, and so they threw it out. But generally speaking, that is the name of that science, or you call it tazkiyat an-nafs, purification of the heart, whatever it is. But you have to purify the heart. That's the goal, right? And then those are the three that we have to know at minimum, or three: aqidah, fard al-ain, and the soul. And then lastly, in terms of implementing it, the goal here is to just do a little bit every day. And this is, I really am going to emphasize a little bit. We want to be consistent in our actions. And so what I would recommend here is we pick 2 to 3 formats that work for us in different types of our life. And we're getting to the practicality component here, and then we're going to end, inshallah. Example, many of us are on the go, or we have phones. So podcasts, excellent format. YouTube lectures or SoundCloud, these types of excellent formats to learn. There's so much knowledge out there in these formats, right? So we're driving. Okay, I have a consistent routine that I'm going to work through this podcast of 50 lectures, and I'm going to listen to one every week, maybe work my way up to one every few days, and then maybe one every day while I'm in my commute or when I'm walking around or something like that. And then another format that's very, very easily digestible, of course, is books, right? Which we have the example of the Book of Assistance. Here we start with 1 or 2 pages a day. We don't overdo it. We have to be careful not to do 50 pages, 100 pages a day, and 100 pages in a day and then get overwhelmed. Just slowly. This stuff can be heavy. The goal is to reflect and implement. It's not to just memorize it and then not implement it. And then if we can go to any type of regular gathering or class or whatever it is, that's also good. In our time, sometimes, especially with COVID, that's limited, but we can attend online. Lighthouse has some of those. Many of the other masajid in the community have gatherings. But those would be like easy ways to do it. We just try to do something consistently. And I'd advise that we try to do a portion of the following whatever rhythm we come up with in our life. We come up with a rhythm. I'm going to do this every week. I'm going to do it on Sundays for 40 minutes on Sundays between, before I go to Sunday brunch, I'm going to read 30 minutes of knowledge. That's my routine. Let's just say you come up with a routine, whatever works. Or on Mondays, I'm going to start my week with it. Or on Fridays, as I finish up work, I'm going to end my week with it. Whatever works for you. And we should have a portion, a little bit, which is devoted to tafsir. A little bit of what you're reading, hadith from books like Riyadh al-Salihin, which there's some excellent translations of Riyadh al-Salihin, the Gardens of the Righteous by Imam al-Nawawi. And then we pick one of the books, and the books that are really, really potent in our time that the ulama recommend are the books of Imam al-Haddad we start with, the Book of Assistance being one, and then there's like many, many others, which once someone is done with the Book of Assistance, you can recommend a few others, and Imam al-Ghazali. Majority of which have been translated to English, and we work our way just through those books. That will be sufficient. We're taking a portion of the Quran, a portion of the Sunnah, and then a portion of the books of the great scholars. And the fiqh books that we study should, of course, be within a school, right? So both Imam Shafi and Imam al-Ghazali, Imam al-Haddad and Imam al-Ghazali were both Shafi. Somebody's Hanafi, they would study a Hanafi fiqh book, as an example. But just a little bit, and you take it and you work through it and you just digest it. And you'll see, it'll start with, I remember 6-7 years ago, I was just before work, 2 pages of this book of assistance. I'm like, okay, I just got to get a chapter in. But it was so easy, Hamza, to get a chapter in. It's 2 pages. And drinking the coffee and reading a chapter, then go on to work. But I was like, oh, this is kind of fun. Like, I actually like this. This actually feels like I'm thinking about something other than what some corporation wants me to think about before I start my day. Then I was like, oh, and I want to learn more. And so knowledge will kind of do that to you. It'll just draw you. And then instead of always thinking about someone else's, dunya problems and money problems, you'll start to be thinking about, oh, how can I fix my life in this way as you go throughout your day. That's the impact and potency of knowledge. And then lastly, the heart, if it doesn't learn, the spiritual heart, if it doesn't learn and spend time learning, it gets sick, really sick. This is when major types of depression, anxiety, worry, and other problems start to overtake the heart because the heart does not have enough portion of knowledge. So inshallah, we'll end with that. If anybody has just a few quick questions, we'll take them and then we'll end. Malik, yeah.
So you said you read that before work?
Yeah, I was just giving an example. Like I was just eating breakfast. I was like, okay, I'm going to just read this book, 2 pages while I'm doing it.
The question is how is your day after you do that?
Yeah, it was really good. It was really good because the day was grounded in something. Like otherwise what was happening, and I think what happens in most of our lives is we start the day and then we start with like either we're studying or we're working and we start immediately, we just dive into that. Or maybe if we wake up and we're scrolling on our phone a little bit and like, news, social media, whatever it is. But starting the day with learning was really helpful because it kind of reoriented the day. But somebody can end the day like that or middle of the day. It doesn't really matter what the time. I was just giving an example of what kind of helped. Does that make sense?
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How does one decide which method to apply?
Yep, it's a good question. The question was, how does one decide which madhab to follow? You should decide. So there's like the easiest madhab in our time is the Hanafi school. As the easiest in terms of just like the types of rules. Ideally, depending if somebody was born Muslim, generally speaking, someone's family will have come from an area where there's a certain madhab that was dominant. You might have just learned Islam that way. So, for example, in the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Turkey, Syria, the Hanafi school was dominant. In the majority of African countries, the Maliki school was dominant in many African countries. And then in like Egypt and some other places, the Shafi school was dominant, right? And so you might just have learned Islam according to something. You will already probably be following a madhab. And, you'll know, like if you pray, if you raise your hand in takbir every time, or if you, the Hanafis don't do that, for example, right? They just raise their hands in takbir ihram and they don't raise their hands in other parts of the prayer. You'll just kind of know, or if you pray with your hands like this, that the Malikis generally will do that, right? They'll pray their hands at their side. But I would just see, okay, is there a madhab I might have actually just learned Islam according to? And then if not, it's good to just kind of ask Allah for guidance on which one would make the most sense for you. And then just pick one and then just stick with it. And it's like only in a few areas where you're generally speaking, you just have to learn these details. In our time, we don't have to learn all the intricate details of every ruling in every situation. It's just in the prayer and fasting and zakat and hajj and a few other areas. Does that make sense? Yeah. Just one other question. Does anybody else have a question? Let me just see if there's any questions here.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yes.
So you said even if you follow that, if you find yourself in a situation where there is a ruling on something that could help, for example, the ocean water or something along those sorts, can you then, in a circumstance like that, adapt that? Or you would say, no, I'm not Hanafi, so I have to go find another source.
Yeah. The question is, if you find yourself in a situation where it becomes, if you want to take the ruling from another school, can you adapt that? As long as somebody is not doing that all the time, from my understanding, that yes, that's totally fine. Allahu alam. But in our times we're living in, it's just the fact that we actually care about the fact if there's a ruling out there is sufficient, right? That we know what's going on and what especially, like, I'll give an example. In the Hanafi school, you generally don't combine your prayers when you're traveling. You shorten the prayers, you don't combine them. But many times, especially in winter, and especially if you have flights to, if you're on a plane, to make sure you pray just on time. Many times people will combine, right? And shorten and combine, because it's very, very difficult to always know exactly when the prayer time is, and in avoidance of missing the prayer altogether, right? But like now, if that person wanted to more strictly follow the school, they wouldn't do that all of the time, right? They would just do that when they need to, let's say in a situation, and then when they're like chilling for a week and a half somewhere and traveling, okay, now I'm going to pray my prayers, shorten but on time. The Shafi and the Maliki and the Hanbali school, you can shorten and combine more often. Does that make sense? So you can take that. I've always learned our teachers to say, like, look, this ruling is valid here, this ruling is valid here, this ruling is valid here. Don't like just pick and choose, but if you need to know, at least know that this is valid and that one of the imams and one of the schools said that it was okay, if that makes sense. Because if we get too strict, we also don't want to be like way too strict and then tell everybody else, you're wrong, your madhab is wrong, your madhab is wrong, and become partisan in it, and then get a little bit too intense on that, right? But the more we can follow one, the better it is. But if we have to, for like, it's called a rukhsa, dispensation, you have to take a dispensation, it's permissible. Yes.
What may help is to read the biographies of these four imams.
Yes.
I mean, they're all incredibly capable and knowledgeable, but there are a couple books in English, so just read through the biographies, and that may help you get a desire.
That's an excellent question. So Brother Ismail suggested that if somebody were to read the biographies of Imam Malik, Ibn Anas, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that you read their biographies, you learn about them, and then you might be drawn to one. Alhamdulillah. Okay, we'll go ahead and end. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما. Ya Allah, we ask that you increase us and that you increase us in knowledge and that you give us the ability to know you and that you give us the ability to get closer and closer to you and that you give us the ability to implement the knowledge that is good for us and that you pardon us for anything that we may have said, Ya Arhamar Rahimi, that you are not pleased with. Ya Allah, we ask that you guide us and our families and our loved ones towards as close towards you and to get as close to you as possible and to follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We ask that you increase our love for the Prophet ﷺ in every single time and especially in this month, and that you allow us to get nearer and nearer to him and nearer to you, Ya Arhamar Rahimin. Ya Allah, and we ask you for everything good that the Prophet ﷺ asked for, and we ask you for protection for everything evil that he asked protection from. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah. There's one of the things scholars mentioned. There's one dua where Allah commanded the Prophet ﷺ to ask for an increase in something. And does anybody know what that thing was? It's the only time you actually commanded to ask for an increase in this thing. Right. قُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. Right, to increase in knowledge. Not generally, you're not asking to increase in all these other things, although there's nothing like haram with it, but Allah is commanding, right? قُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا, that my Lord increase me in knowledge. So, alhamdulillah, there's also deep wisdom there. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika.